This is the gray wolf, and the gray wolf is a somewhat of a recovery story worldwide. It's never been truly endangered because it's such a widespread creature, but it has made improvements from being vulnerable to being more of least concerned. The wolf is a large predator, and it tends to focus on large game such as deer, large deer, elk, moose, even, and they tend to live in wild areas. They're pretty flexible, though. They could live in even in deserts and forests, tundra. So they're found, worldwide, kind of all over the world. But their numbers were really were on the decline because people were afraid of them and afraid that they were going to eat their livestock and kill their sheep and threaten humans. And so they were hunted. And that's pretty much how most of their range or most of the wolves were disappearing, is because of hunting, but also from habitat destruction. And we've fragmented the wildlands, and they tend to like it pretty wild. They don't live as often where there's a lot of human interference. And so they like it wild. So when we cut down the forests or, encroach on their lands with development, the wolves tend to get pushed out. And they need a large range because they need large game usually, although they will eat smaller game if they're forced to. But they need large game, so they need a large area to be able to get all the food that they need to be able to support their pack. So here is, they were vulnerable up until around the 1990s, where they started to improve on the endangered species list, going from vulnerable to least concern. What I'm going to talk about here is a little bit more focused on the United States, because the wolf population essentially went extinct in the United States, except for a little corner up around Minnesota. Now, the worldwide population overall had declined by about a third because of this persecution and the changes to habitat. But because there's been the legal protections in the Endangered Species Act and all that, and there's been land use changes, that and more education, people start to understand that the wolf isn't as much of a threat as they would often think. We've actually seen its decline slow down or stop, and even having some wolf populations recover. And in the United States, there has been a reintroduction of wolves that has actually been quite successful. So I'm just going to show you here, there was a wolf population introduced to Wyoming, Yellowstone National Park. And there was also, so that's up here, and then there was also a wolf population introduced to Idaho. And they took wolves from Canada, from the Rockies, and reintroduced them to these two places. And those wolf populations have actually reproduced and started to expand. And now you can actually find wolves in both Washington and Oregon because of them migrating. All right. So the wolves, though, they were considered, when they reintroduced them to the places like Yellowstone and Idaho, because they were introduced, those wolves that were specifically introduced, they didn't quite get the same federal protections that a wild wolf population would get. But however, when some of them started to seed into new places like Oregon, they were protected by the Endangered Species Act, and they couldn't be hunted. And there was a lot of other policies that were put forth to try to help preserve wolves, like having hunters, providing money for hunters to be able to put deterrents out for wolves that were non-lethal, like not putting poison bait and things like that. That was a really common way to kill wolves. And also, if they did, like telling them, okay, if you do lose livestock, we will financially replace that. So there's a lot of funds put out both privately and by the government to do that. There, of course, still is threats, even though the population has been growing in a lot of places. Competition for livestock, again, farmers being scared, and people being afraid of wolves, poisoning them, people wanting to hunt them. There's habitat degradation can also isolate wolves to an extent that they can't get a big enough range to be able to establish enough food. the main benefit of what's we've noticed though with this large wolf recovery is that there's a lot of both intrinsic and extrinsic. Like intrinsic, people are very proud and like the fact that the wolf can exist in these wild places, and so that has been a significant change. But there's also extrinsic um, benefits to it, and that has a lot to do with ecosystem services. When the wolf was returned, it actually improved because when they took the wolf away, the rivers tended to change their course because there was a lot more elk that were then feeding down and eating a lot of the trees, which meant the beavers didn't have the trees to be able to eat and make their homes. The coyote population started to explode. And so there was actually a pretty large ecosystem shift. But when the wolves were returned and they were hunting the elk, so they tended to be more in like the forested areas and not on the fields. And we actually saw the recovery of a lot of riparian, meaning like river areas. And there was a significant shift in a lot of these species returning to what they used to be. And those ecosystem services, if you have better rivers, you're going to have more fish in the rivers. And that's actually good for other intrinsic things such as sport fishermen, and being able to go out to different places and spend money, tourist dollars, because they can go out fishing in those places. And of course, people are going to visit places like Yellowstone because they want to go see the wolves. So you're going to see increased tourist revenue. So there's that aspect of it, but also in the ranges where elk and deer populations tend to explode, they tend to eat down a lot of the vegetation and have to be managed in other ways. And so being able to reduce those populations so they're not doing damage to the local, forest and ecosystems, that can actually save money there as well. Some of the things that just kind of need to continue is that the wolves were actually delisted recently in the current administration, just about 10 days ago, January 6th. And they are there's a lot of groups like Sierra Club and some World Wildlife Federation. They're suing the government, trying to get them put back onto the endangered species list in the United States. And hopefully those protections will continue, and more education efforts so people are not afraid of wolves, and being able to compensate farmers if there's any losses, which actually, when the wolves tend to be wild, they don't have those issues so much. So that's why a lot of it's education, but having that peace of mind is usually quite helpful. Also, just trying to maintain as many wild and protected areas as possible to keep that large range available for wolves.